Why did John Smythe escape culpable homicide charges over a boy who died in Zimbabwe? We speak to the prosecutor who was removed from the case. Good evening from Cape Town. The evangelical Christian John Smythe, who has sparked a crisis in the Church of England, moved here after multiple allegations of abuse and a charge of culpable homicide in Zimbabwe. What we can reveal tonight is that worrying questions about his behaviour had been widely circulated a decade before the tragic death of 16-year-old Guy Nachuru. Boys forbidden from wearing pants and beaten if they did. Boys led by Smythe in prayer while naked. So why wasn't he stopped then? Or indeed several years earlier when senior church figures found out about the allegations in the UK? Tonight we speak to the prosecutor who brought charges against Smythe in Zimbabwe, casting new light on why he believes the case collapsed.
Also tonight, just as the West is moving closer to Assad, shocking revelations from Syria. Amnesty International has evidence tonight that up to 13,000 civilians have been executed in this Damascus prison over the past 5 years. The Assad regime at times hanging some 50 to 100 people in a week. The government here publishes its plans for housing. 250,000 new homes needed a year, but the minister refuses to set targets, and critics say it all lacks any new vision. And MPs win a chance to vote on the government's final Brexit deal, but only to choose between leaving the EU with whatever deal has been negotiated or leaving with no deal at all.
And we continue our special series on fake news. If fake news has a real front line, it is surely in the Baltic states, with their large Russian minorities. Here, Moscow has been pumping out propaganda that is far more subtle and effective than the old Soviet stuff.
Я не работаю в Альтмедиа.
You don't work for Altmedia. So why are you in their
У
offices?
меня договоренность с Александром Корниговым.
Do you produce Russian propaganda here?
Ну, то есть, что такое, вот, в вашем понимании, пропаганда?
Good evening from Cape Town, where we've tracked down the man at the centre of the abuse scandal that has rocked the church. John Smythe is accused of violently beating dozens of young men he'd groomed at Christian holiday camps in the UK in the late 1970s. But he wasn't reported to the police at the time, allowing him to move to Africa, where more alleged abuse took place. Tonight, this programme has obtained new evidence of repeated warnings about Smythe for a decade before he was finally arrested in Zimbabwe. And we speak to the prosecutor from that country on why the case against Smythe collapsed.
Tourist Mecca, expat enclave. Cape Town is, for many, the perfect getaway. And so it's proved for John Smythe, the British barrister and evangelical Christian, dogged by abuse allegations in the UK and then Zimbabwe. Last week, Channel 4 News reported allegations that more than 3 decades ago, Smythe violently abused young men at his home in Britain, but it wasn't reported to the police at the time. Now Hampshire police are finally investigating him. We paid him a visit at the place he and his wife call home, just outside Cape Town and behind these alarmed gates. This is Mr. Smythe's house. There doesn't seem to be anyone at home right now, or if there is, that no one's answering the bell. So I'm going to try and give him another call and see what happens.
Please leave us a message and we'll be glad to get back to you.
Mr. Smythe, it's Kathy Newman here from Channel 4 News. I've got a few questions I'd really like to ask you. Your alleged violent abuse. The church and your own children are urging you to talk to the police. Do please call me back. You have my number. This is the evangelical church Smythe now attends. The pastor here admitted that he'd recently given spiritual counselling to university students. He said he was broken to think the church might have put young people at risk. You can live very well in Cape Town, and certainly John Smythe seems to have established a comfortable life for himself here. But we have disturbing new evidence about the abuse allegations he left behind in Zimbabwe. Channel 4 News has obtained new documents from Zimbabwe revealing that almost constant concerns about Smythe were raised as early as 1986, a decade before he was arrested and charged by police there. But the holiday camps run by Smythe and the beatings continued. At one of the camps in 1991, the documents say,
The younger boys were not permitted to wear underclothing. At shower times, Mr. Smythe would stand in the nude in the vicinity of the shower area. Mr. Smythe led the boys in prayer whilst he was naked. If a boy was caught wearing underwear, corporal punishment was administered.
In 1992, 16-year-old Guy Nachuru was found dead at the bottom of the swimming pool at one of Smythe's camps. It changed everything. Now other young men came forward about beatings at the camps, and eventually Zimbabwean police charged Smythe with culpable homicide and assault. Smythe says Guy's death was a very unfortunate drowning incident. The prosecutor who charged him, Herbert Ushabakunza, now lives in South Africa and agreed to talk to me about why he believes the case collapsed.
At one point, I received a call from a very close relative of mine, very close. I would not say who it was, but quite close. Asking me, hey, look, you're doing this case, you know what I mean, it was a call. I said, yeah. I said, how do you think it's going to go? I said, come on, man. You know me, I'll get a conviction. There's evidence, you know. It was not boastful, it was a fact. The evidence was there. Now, unbeknownst to me, that conversation was being taped. And a couple of weeks later, our office received a notice of motion from the court alleging bias and interest on my part.
Smythe alleged the prosecutor was biased because his relative was connected to the case. The judge agreed and the prosecutor was removed.
I mean, the judge was very critical of you. Some of the things that he said, that you fell far short of the customary standards of fairness and detachment demanded of a prosecutor. You lost objectivity and impartiality. There was an inexcusable failure to correct the facts. This was really quite damning, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, it was. My feeling, you know what made me feel bad? Was that I got vilified and John Smythe got away with it. That's what really irked me. You know, they were failed. That's my opinion. They were failed by the judicial protection. Fine, rap me on the knuckles, get him.
He doesn't understand why another prosecutor wasn't appointed before Smythe left Zimbabwe for South Africa.
We get rid of Herbert, get somebody else who's not Herbert. Charges are still the same. Do you know what I mean? So I think he got advice that, look, hit the road, Jack.
Smythe has consistently refused to answer any of our questions about the alleged abuse and what took place in Zimbabwe.
Do you think he will face justice now?
If he's a man. If he's a man, and he's a man of God, or of the cloth and all that type of thing, then yes. Otherwise, it means he's using religion as a cover to hide his badness, basically.
One of John Smythe's daughters told Channel 4 News in a statement that her father should leave his Cape Town sunspot and answer the allegations piling up against him in neighbouring Zimbabwe and half a world away in the UK. She said the reports were deeply troubling and had left her shocked and disturbed.
Well, with me now is the Very Reverend Michael Wieder, who's the Dean of St George's Cathedral, which is the main Anglican place of worship here in Cape Town. John Smythe is living here, just up the road, and the allegations keep on piling up. What do you think should be done?
I think it's important that Mr. Smythe be able to return back to where he needs to give an account of his behavior. And at the same time, the fact that he's been here and by the record what happened back in the UK, I don't think we should be astounded if we find that there have been similar incidents happening here in South Africa. So,
really?
I think
have you heard of any rumours?
No, but I think that there should be an alertness on our authority side to pay some deeper attention to his behavior and conduct while in our city, if not in our country.
So you'd like the authorities here in the church to be actively working out if anything untoward has gone on here?
Well, less the authorities here, because we have very limited jurisdiction. We are an Anglican Diocese of Cape Town. In 2013, the Bishop of Ely, we learned yesterday, informed Archbishop Thabo.
That's the Archbishop of Cape Town.
Of Cape Town, of the fact of this gentleman's hear about or presence in our country. But it was under the radar. There was no specific mention of what part of Cape Town. We got three, in the greater part of Cape Town, we got 3 dioceses. And so his behavior was of such a nature that it wasn't brought to the attention of our diocese. So we have got limited impact and influence.
But the fact is that it's all very well making these inquiries now, but the church in the UK, the church in Zimbabwe, all sorts of people could have stopped this much earlier than it has been stopped.
No, I think there is very little, despite what I said, our defense would seem very shallow in the light of the fact that there are similar unravelings globally and also within our own diocese, within our own country. There's no justifiable way that we can explain that we haven't paid greater attention to it. It's a question of respectability. It's respect to the way masculinity is embroidered and presented in our society. And it depends who the accusers are and how strong their voices are, and with the kind of power, access to lawyers, it's always the vulnerable that are targeted and pursued in that matter.
Why particularly the church, though? I mean, the church appears to be a sort of hotbed of abuse allegations. Why do you think that is?
I think anywhere where predators can prey on the vulnerable, be it the Boy Scouts, church choirs, wherever young people are assembled in great number, there is a desire for a father image, gentleness, kindness. And the church, the mosque, the temple, the synagogue, all of us, that is our core business. Vulnerability, espousal of love, and that makes us a very attractive feature in society.
Reverend Michael Weeder, thank you very much for joining me. That's it from Cape Town for now, but we'll be back tomorrow from here. And back to you now, John and Matt in the studio in London.
Cathy Newman. Now, Amnesty International says that up to 13,000 people have been secretly executed in a Syrian jail. The human rights group says that the mass hangings have been taking place every week at Sudnaya prison near Damascus since the war began in 2011. Those killed, it says, are mostly civilians who opposed the Assad regime, and their executions must have been authorized at the very highest levels of the Syrian government. Fatima Manji has this report.
I wish they had killed me, rather than leave me to rot in this place. This is not a prison. It's a slaughterhouse.
It's allegedly a secret, systematic torture and killing machine. Sudnaya prison on the outskirts of Damascus, visualised here by Amnesty, who say the abuse inside is authorised by the highest levels of Syrian government. The report says most detainees are civilians, arrested since 2011, held inside the Red Building, where they're beaten, tortured and starved. In the middle of the night, some are blindfolded and transferred to the White Building, where they are hanged. Amnesty believe between 5,000 and 13,000 people have been killed in this way, condemned through military courts, which last no longer than 3 minutes. Those who survived tell stories of rape, beatings and hunger. This is witness testimony from Amnesty. The photographs show the men before and after being inside the prison.
My cellmate had been beaten. The wounds were becoming black. He developed gangrene. The whole hallway could smell it. The guards stopped coming because of the smell. The doctor couldn't even look at it. He said the legs would have to be amputated. He died on the 17th of April 2014 in front of me.
The thirst was indescribable. We would lick the condensation from the wall and ceilings. By the 9th day, people started drinking their own urine. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine how thirsty and broken a human needs to be in order to do that?
We spoke to one former prisoner, now living in Germany. He says he was in Sudnaya for 9 months because of political activism on Facebook.
The signs of torture are still in my body. My hand, my leg, my belly, all from the beating. One of the guys who died, he had kidney problems. After a week, we saw he wasn't moving. They beat him even after he was dead. They said you should not die, just be tortured.
Amnesty spent a year trying to build a step-by-step picture of just what was going on inside. They spoke to 84 witnesses, now mainly in Turkey.
These witnesses included former guards and officials from the prison, as well as former detainees who had made it out and had actually witnessed various stages of the execution process. Then we also interviewed former judges and then Syrian lawyers to complete the picture.
It's now calling for an urgent UN investigation into the prison. Throughout 5 years of war, the Syrian government has repeatedly denied torture. Today, President Assad gave an interview to Belgian TV. He was asked if all means were justified in the fight against terrorism.
When they attack civilians and killing civilians and beheading people and destroying properties, our constitutional duty and legal duty as government and as army and as state institutions is to defend the Syrian people. It's not an opinion, it's a duty. So regarding this, you can use every means in order to defend the Syrian people.
But who will defend the Syrian people when it's the government itself accused of carrying out the attacks?
Fatima Manji reporting. Now, the average house price is now 10 times the average yearly income. Getting on the housing ladder is an impossible dream, while rising rents are a miserable reality for millions. The answer, at least 250,000 new homes a year, according to ministers. Launching the long-delayed white paper, the Community Secretary Sajid Javid told MPs there was a need for more affordable housing. It's from our business correspondent, Hilya Ibrahimi.
The housing market is broken. Today, even the government admitted that. The question is whether their white paper is just painting over the cracks.
I've got to be honest with people. We can't just flick a switch and make housing affordable overnight. For 30 years as a country, under governments of all colours, we've not built enough homes. And fundamentally, the only solution to fixing the market is to build more homes so that housing becomes more affordable, whether you're trying to rent or buy. So what would be easy for you is if there was one single silver bullet I could produce out as a rabbit out of the hat and say that's going to solve the problem. I think if such a thing existed, one of my predecessors over the last 30 years would have found it.
There's actually a lot in this white paper. But if you look at the detail, none of it stacks up to face up to the scale of the housing crisis in this country. Skeptics in the industry say a lot of the measures are just rehashed policies, while some of the government's ideas could cause as many problems as they solve. More than a decade ago, the former Bank of England economist Kate Barker suggested around 250,000 new homes a year would need to be built to meet population demands. That never happened, and today the government distanced itself from even its more modest ambition of 200,000 homes. For Barker, a disappointing turn of events.
So the good thing in this housing white paper is I think it pushes policy forward helpfully in a number of small ways. The bad thing in it is there's nothing really big about the future. There's nothing about where should we really put new towns. If you were thinking about the long term, you'd be saying London. How do we get the councils around London to work with the transport providers to think where can we put really new towns with really good transport links? That takes years in the planning. Just saying let's wait for local authorities to come forward hasn't worked over the past 5 years or so. I see no reason why it's going to work in the future.
Too short-term and too political. Even within the same parties, governments rarely stick with the same goals. Labour was all about national planning before the coalition and Eric Pickles introduced localism. Today that was overturned again. Another shift from the David Cameron years is that Number 10 has now opened its arms to housing associations, marking a change to the love-in with big house builders.
I think we do have a government that understands that there is a pressing need to build more homes and they want to get on and do it. I'm not sure that the measures themselves are strong enough to be able to deliver, but what we really need is political will. You know, the great British public now say we want new, ordinary, affordable homes in our area, and I don't think the politicians have caught up with that yet. What we need at a local level and at a national level is political leadership that says this is priority objective number one. We want a thriving economy in a post-Brexit world. You cannot do it unless you have the housing stock that we need.
This is a property which is a new build.
Azad Assam is a small house builder who says the current system doesn't work. Many of today's proposals are directed at getting more companies like his to compete effectively with their larger rivals.
It's good that the government's actually come clean and actually said it is broken, because it's the first time a housing minister or somebody in a position like that to actually admit the truth. And if you look across Europe, you will see that a lot of the properties are actually built by small builders like myself. So you have a lot of self-builds. Austria is about 80%. The average in Europe is approximately 65 to 70% of people build their own homes. In the UK, it's 11%. So you have to ask the question, why is that? And the main reason why is because there's no incentives. The planning process is extremely complicated and frustrating for small builders like myself. And you also don't have the tax breaks that you have in Europe.
While Azad and housing associations might be pleased with today's measures, there are many things conspicuously absent from the paper, like borrowing freedoms for local councils. But the main ingredient missing is a big vision for how to fix the housing market, rather than just making good surface issues.
Well, the pressure on councils to find the cash for more homes couldn't come at a worse time for many. Already struggling to fund social care for the elderly, they're now finding council tenants falling into rent arrears because of the changeover to universal credit. Some claimants are being left without any cash for months on end. Tomorrow, the architect of the government's welfare reform, Lord Freud, will be in Parliament to explain what is not working for this flagship policy. Here's our social affairs editor, Jackie Long.
A simpler system that reduces administration and makes it easier for individuals to get what they are entitled to when they need it, without major squabbles or rows or a real sense that they have to jump through 50 hoops.
Bridgewater in Somerset, one of the first places in the country where universal credit has been extended beyond single job seekers. For Doreen Bowen, a mother who's unemployed, it hasn't lived up to IDS's billing of a straightforward system that makes sure people get what they need.
They say it only takes 6 weeks to get up and running, but it doesn't. I didn't get any money for 2 months, and the rent didn't even get paid for 3 months. So that left me 3 months in arrears, which came out to 1,000 and some odd. My mum bought my food. She'd buy my milk, my sugar, my tea bags.
And were the council quite sympathetic because the problems were all to do with universal credit?
Yeah. Even they couldn't understand how the money situation worked out, so we were all confused.
Doreen's not the only tenant who needed help to avoid being evicted after being transferred onto universal credit. Homes in Sedgemoor manage more than 4,000 properties for the local council.
Our arrears have gone up by 50%, from around 160,000 getting on to £300,000.
What is it about universal credit that poses those difficulties for your tenants?
I think the biggest difficulties are firstly the waiting period, which averages 6 to 7 weeks with no money whatsoever. And for some people that's been as long as 10 weeks before they've received the housing element to pay over to us. And so during that time, I think the expectation is that people will have saved money for that rainy day. The reality around here with so many people in seasonal work is that they don't have any savings. People are living hand to mouth initially, and so to suggest that they can pay their rent, it's out of thin air really. It's not going to happen.
Universal credit has been beset by problems and huge delays. The Department for Work and Pensions predicted that by this point 7 million people would be claiming universal credit, when in fact fewer than 500,000 people have been transferred across. Evidence shows many of those have waited months for any money at all. Their rent arrears are soaring, and housing associations are warning that problems with universal credit are having a devastating impact on families' lives. Latest figures show it's a problem across the country. 86% of universal credit claimants living in council homes are in arrears. The average amount they owe has almost doubled in 6 months, from £321 to £615. Halton Housing Trust in Cheshire, for example, has just 1,000 tenants on universal credit, but 920 of them are in arrears. In Croydon, there are 1,622 council tenants receiving universal credit, 1,258 in arrears. And there are other aspects of universal credit which have changed. Government cuts of £3 billion make the promise to make work pay harder to deliver.
Before, overall, the system was more generous. Now it's less generous,
And so we expect to see more people losing, and those losses actually greater than before, whereas the gainers are also, they're still gaining, or some of them are still gaining, but by less.
Doreen says she hopes to return to work, but is still frightened she'd be worse off. She says the principle of universal credit isn't matched in practice.
I don't think that they've really thought about it, how it affects people. They've just said, yeah, if we bring this in, it'll be okay.
The Department for Work and Pensions said in a statement this evening they're aware there have been some issues rolling out universal credit and that they were providing extra support. The best way to help people pay rent, it said, was work. And universal credit has seen more people moving into work faster and staying in work longer than the old system.
Jackie Long reporting. Now, the government has survived a threatened backbench revolt over its Brexit bill tonight, despite Downing Street playing down a supposed concession to allow MPs a vote at the end of negotiations. When MPs voted on a key amendment to the bill, the government had a comfortable majority. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Parliament's central lobby. Gary, how much did the government concede today?
Well, what the rebels and the opposition parties were looking for was a concession that said that Parliament would get a vote before the ink is dry on any sort of deal, before it's been properly shaken on, before the 28 members of the European Union, Britain and the other 27, have sat round a table and agreed it, so that Parliament could have the option of actually turning around and saying, actually, don't like the look of that deal, go back and negotiate something different. That was what the rebels were looking for, the promise of a moment like that, a potential moment. And some of them thought they'd got that. Indeed, Keir Starmer, speaking for the Labour Party, sounded like he thought that something like that had been secured. But as the debate went on, things got a little bit more fractious. A lot of people probing, wondering whether they'd really got what they thought. And at the end, you ended up with 7 Tory MPs voting against their own government, and Nicky Morgan, the former schools secretary, she actually abstained in the end, but a couple of MPs have reported to me hearing some pretty fruity exchanges between her and the chief whip, with her saying words to the effect, I'll edit these a bit, I'm not prepared to be lied to, don't count on me for future votes. So in the end, the government got the result that it wanted and hopes that it sent a message, there's one more day in the Commons, hopes it sent a message to the Lords when it goes there and that they don't mess around with their bill too much. Here's a little excerpt that gives you a flavour of one of the rebels, Ken Clarke, as ever, trying to extract assurances from the government minister.
So my honourable friends confirmed that the vote is put to Parliament after the deal has been done with the Commission and the Council. It's a done deal. The European Parliament and this House either take it or leave it. The alternative is the WTO. Will you confirm that is exactly what was offered in the white paper a few days ago?
Exactly right.
What we have sought to do today is to provide clarity.
Now, Gary, some rejoiced, some MPs were absolutely revolted by the Speaker's intervention last night. How did he deal with that today?
Yes, it split the Commons. He ended up having to say something because the Lord Speaker down the corridor turned around and said he regretted that he hadn't been consulted before the Commons Speaker had spoken about whether President Trump should come. Mr. Speaker Bercow apologised for that. But the ructions go on over this, and one person who's worked with Speaker Bercow over the years said he's obviously announced in advance that he actually plans to stand down maybe next year, and they wondered whether this was possibly an attempt to try and extend his term, but the MP turned around to me and said more likely he's just trying to raise the price of his speaking fees for when he retires.
Gary Gibbon at Westminster. Matt.
Now, if you, like us, were somewhat puzzled by the assertion from Donald Trump yesterday that the very, very dishonest media were underreporting terrorist attacks around the world, well, the White House has now listed 78 acts of terrorism which it claims were indeed underreported. The list includes heavily covered attacks in Paris, Berlin, Nice, and Brussels. And the administration is back in court later today trying to reinstate its travel ban. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now. Kylie, they're busy, you're busy. What's going on?
Well, some degree of puzzlement here too, Matt, over that
extraordinary list. And the media outlets here have been pushing back at a press briefing held by the White House, and Sean Spicer asking how can he justify including those events on that list when clearly most of them were very well covered by most outlets. Sean Spicer's responded by saying that the events did not get the spectacular attention that they deserve. That's a direct quote. He says that the president cares about protecting the country, and he wants to show how the earth is a very dangerous place, and it speaks to his unwavering commitment to keep the country safe. Now, it also speaks to a perception of risk among American voters, which of course would help to if you like, boost support for the current travel ban on Muslim-majority countries, on citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries and refugees. As you mentioned, that is back before the courts tonight in San Francisco. Government lawyers will be trying to get that ban restored. But when he was asked about that today, President Trump said he is determined to push it through. Here's what he said.
We're going to take it through the system. It's very important. It's very important for the country. Regardless of me or whoever succeeds at a later date, I mean, we have to have security in our country. We have to have the ability. When you take some place like Syria, you take all of the different people pouring around. And if you remember, ISIS said, we are going to infiltrate the United States and other countries through the migration. And then we're not allowed to be tough on the people coming in? Explain that one.
Trump does seem to be coming under some pressure, Kylie. Is there any sign that the administration is cracking?
No cracks, Matt, but certainly I think some awkwardness. For example, the Homeland Security Secretary has just spoken to Congress and had to explain that maybe it would have been good if Congress had been consulted on the ban before the president signed off on it. But they've just had a big victory. They've managed to get their Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, a very controversial appointee, finally pushed through Congress. It took Mike Pence, the vice president, to step in, but she has now been confirmed. Donald Trump is getting this cabinet together. The question is, will he listen to any of them?
Thanks, Kylie. Well, we're joined now from Henley-on-Thames by Ted Malloch, who has worked as an advisor to Donald Trump and is being lined up to become the next US ambassador to the EU. Welcome to the program, Ted Malloch. Hello, can you hear me? You're there. Are you there? Hello, Ted Malloch? Can you hear me? Hello? OK, we'll try and get back to that later on.
Now, a video recording has been shown in a London court of an injured Afghan insurgent being shot dead by a Royal Marine. The extract was played at the start of an appeal hearing on behalf of Sergeant Alexander Blackman, who was jailed for murder by a court-martial 3 years ago. Our chief correspondent Alex Thompson was in court.
Blackman's wife arrives to cheering supporters at the High Court. The Daily Mail's run a high-profile campaign to fund this appeal. But as Blackman's QC told the court today, the paper itself hasn't contributed a penny towards it. Highly edited video from the day Blackman killed the POW has been released already, as has audio of just what Blackman said to his men seconds after he shot the wounded prisoner as he lay writhing on the ground.
Yeah, shut off this mortal coil, you nothing you would do to us.
I know.
Exactly. All right. Obviously, this doesn't go anywhere, fellas.
Yeah, roger, mate.
I've just broken Geneva Convention.
Yeah, roger. Today, though, a great deal more material was shown to the court-martial appeal court, again filmed by the helmet cam of one of Blackman's men.
The images clearly show Sergeant Blackman commanding his men calmly as they move the gravely injured man from open ground into ground covered with vegetation. They're concerned that the helicopter overhead may see what happens next. The man is still moving, still clearly alive. As soon as the helicopter has gone, he shoots the man through the torso. He continues to convulse and twitch for several seconds before becoming still.
The video shows Blackman training his pistol at the chest of the bloodied prisoner for some time, waiting for the helicopter to clear the area before he shoots. The appeal's been allowed because of claims from 3 psychiatrists that Blackman was suffering from a known stress disorder at the time, which means diminished responsibility for his actions, and thus the conviction should be changed to manslaughter or quashed altogether.
The defence case rests around the reports of a number of psychiatrists, some of whom have a military background. They say that at the time these events happened, Sergeant Blackman was suffering from what they call an adjustment disorder, a spectrum which can mean anything from no symptoms right through to violent actions. But for their case to succeed, they'll have to convince the panel of 5 judges presided over by the Lord Chief Justice that when Sergeant Blackman shot this man, his judgment was not just impaired, but substantially impaired. The case continues.
Well, let's try again to speak to Ted Malloch, a former advisor to Donald Trump and possibly the next US ambassador to the EU. Ted Malloch, welcome to the programme. First of all, can I ask you your reaction to the comments of the Speaker, John Bercow, who said he doesn't want Donald Trump to address the House of Commons because he is, quote, sexist and racist? What do you say to that?
Well, I thought the comments were both sad, inappropriate, and hypocritical. Sad because President Trump has just extended not just a hand, but his full arm to the British government in an act of friendship, and the renewal of the so-called UK-US special relationship was just about to restart. I thought it was inappropriate because, as a student of British politics, I thought that the Speaker's role was one sort of above politics, and frankly, he was supposed to show a degree of impartiality.
But can you see
why? Finally, I thought it was also hypocritical because if you look back at who has spoken at the House of Parliament, you have people like the dictatorial leader of China, the king of Saudi Arabia, the president of Zimbabwe, the president of Egypt.
But can you see why many people in this country,
even the communist dictator of Romania?
But
my question would be, what are the criteria that are being employed?
Okay. Can you see why some people in this country, in fact, many people, possibly millions of people, are not happy about the visit of Donald Trump? I mean, the petition's been signed by almost 2 million people asking him not to come, saying to the government, don't invite him on the state visit. And frankly, every morning we wake up to another torrent of tweets out of the White House, which to many people here is either puzzling or alarming. Do you see why people here in Europe and in England are upset about it?
There are a large number of people in the United States as well who didn't vote for this president, who are protesting his presidency or trying to delegitimize it at every turn. So he definitely has his opponents, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. Of course, he was elected in the American election through our electoral college in an overwhelming vote. So yes, I'm quite aware of the protests. And in fact, that's the nature of democracy. One should be allowed to protest.
But the nature of democracy is also respect for your opponents and respect for the institutions of your great country. Now, when Donald Trump tweets about so-called judges and calls their judgments in federal court betrayal, do you sit comfortably with that as an academic, as someone who teaches about the American system?
Well, I think we have a different style of presidency, clearly. He uses a different kind of rhetoric. He used it during the campaign. Some people thought it would go away when he became president. I was at the inauguration. His inauguration speech was different, frankly, than many other inaugurations. And he uses Twitter and social media to communicate directly with the public in a much different style. So no, there is no change.
So tell me, does he, and indeed do you, relish the opprobrium that you're getting in places like Europe? I mean, when you said that the other day that you think the European Union might need some unraveling, and people got very upset in Brussels, people called you malevolent, they said they were going to block your nomination as US ambassador. Do you actually like that? Do you like that kind of opprobrium?
No, I'm not seeking it. It's not something that anyone or any one government would choose. In order to call someone malevolent, I've said you have to have a theory of good and evil, and I don't think that they do. So I think it's a mischaracterization. But we are also in a different historical period. So America's relationship with the European Union is going to be different under President Trump than it was under President Obama.
Okay, Ted Malloch, thank you very much indeed. John.
After the break, amid the concerns about Russian threats to security in the Baltic states, we hear how fake news websites are being used to spread pro-Russian propaganda and stir up ethnic passions. Welcome back. Now, it's Channel 4's Fake News Week, but just what is fake, what's a half-truth, and what is just good old-fashioned propaganda? Across the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, with their significant populations of ethnic Russians, numerous web-based portals have sprung up, pumping out what activists say is Russian propaganda, funded by Moscow. Our reporter Porrick O'Brien has been to the front line of the information war.
The ghosts of Soviet past stalk the streets of Estonia again. NATO troops line borders against emboldened Russia. And in these parts, the information battle lines have already been crossed. The old Viru Hotel, once KGB controlled, a Soviet symbol that screams information is power. The rooms and restaurants bugged to blackmail, heady days and nights recorded to compromise. We're going to the hotel's 23rd floor. That's right, the 23rd floor. The KGB control room, the switchboard for a network of tiny microphones. These old wires, the medium of Russian influence. Nowadays, the wires are fibre optic. Another hotel in Tallinn. We meet a member of the group Propostop, the new breed of information activist. He's asked for anonymity to avoid being targeted by Russian hackers. Our story starts with a Facebook post he wants to show us. It will end, he says, with the Kremlin. The Facebook post tells the tale of a group of British troops with the NATO mission to Estonia. According to the post, the soldiers were rude to an elderly lady in a hospital waiting room in Tallinn. She didn't have a seat, they wouldn't give her theirs. At which point, our plucky storyteller confronts the troops and ends up with the following flurry in English. I am an agent of Putin, she says, and we are everywhere. The strange little tale was shared a few times with friends and then disappeared into the ether. Not so much. It was, in fact, picked up by the Baltic States news portal Bolt News. It went viral. With hundreds of British troops en route to the Baltic States, the subtext of the story, NATO troops are not only coming to bully Mother Russia with tanks on the border, they're also coming to bully your granny. The problem with the Bolt News story. The MOD told us that when the article was published, there were only about 5 British military personnel in Tallinn, including a general and a handful of officials. Also, the original Facebook source has deleted the post, has not responded to our request for more detail, and is quoted in other similar type stories on Bolt News. This is one example. There are others, even some real news, on Bolt News. It popped up 2 years ago. Its Estonian office is here in an industrial estate in Tallinn.
So this is the office block where the registered offices of Bolt News / Alt Media are, and it's 205 is the number where it's registered, which is down here.
A sister company called Alt Media is also registered here.
Hello. How are you doing? Is this Bolt News? Is Mr. Kornilov in there?
Я не работаю в Альтмедиа.
You don't work for Alt Media. So why are you in their office?
Почему вы здесь?
У меня договоренность с Александром Корниловым.
Do you produce Russian propaganda here?
Ну, то есть, что такое, вот, вашему вниманию, пропаганда?
And are these, has the police been here?
Да.
Okay, that's what this tape is. I see.
The police were here for the boss, Alexander Kornilov.
Hello, is that Mr. Kornilov?
We've temporarily commandeered the old KGB control room to track him down. The man who runs Bolt News and Alt Media was arrested last year by police on suspicion of tax fraud. It's alleged that he didn't pay the requisite taxes on money his organisation received from Moscow. It's one of the ways the Estonian equivalent to MI5 is clamping down on what they call subversive Russian influences. The intelligence services here in no doubt about the end game.
The goal is to make Russia great again, or make it superpower again.
We start with Bolt News and Alexander Kornilov.
He's pro-Kremlin activist. I wouldn't call him journalist.
Does he call himself a journalist?
Sure.
Is he?
They call themselves journalists, yeah. But they are coordinated from Russia and
How do you know they're coordinated from Russia?
this is I cannot go into details on that, but we know.
Is it money?
Yeah, they get money, yeah.
From Moscow?
Yes.
Kornilov wouldn't do an interview on camera, but told us he's standing by his journalism and said the tax case against him was politically motivated. There's another layer to our story. For that, we travel south to Riga, Latvia. This is the NATO agency that monitors fake news. Yes, such a thing exists, and the UK is a contributing partner. We started with mechanics. Now for the big picture. A new trend, according to NATO, for Russian money to buy existing clickbait sites and bit by bit transform them.
That sort of clickbait business, they introduced the sentiments, the news.
So are you saying to me, Yanis, that pro-Russian businessmen are buying up entertainment websites and changing them into Russian propaganda organizations?
They've exposed themselves being part of the pro-Russian political forces.
A second trend, for Russian-funded think tanks in the West to basically launder fake news, to give it a veneer of academic credibility, a thin sheet of solid ice on top of the slush. So, it's sophisticated, and according to NATO, designed to drive a wedge, first between the ethnically Russian community and the Baltic states they live in, but ultimately to do the same to organizations like the EU.
You don't need tanks. You might actually achieve your goals if you change the perception patterns of a given society in a way that corresponds to your interests, and the society starts to act how you want them to act.
This is the NATO perspective, of course, and it's worth remembering that propaganda changes to news and vice versa, depending on your world view. Fake news is nothing new in the Baltic states. There's history here. Take the barricades in Riga in '91. The threat of Soviet aggression prompted thousands not only to surround government buildings, but also the radio and television stations. 7 people were killed, people who wanted to protect the independence of the narrative. In other words, they formed a human shield around, believe it or not, the mainstream media. For these people, fake news wasn't something you liked or disliked on Facebook. It was something worth laying your life on the line for to stop.
Joining us now to discuss fake news and trust in the media is the Washington Post columnist Anne Applebaum, who is launching a project with the London School of Economics which will investigate the spreading of untrue information. And from Los Angeles, we have the author Jared Kobek, who says that the mainstream media was guilty of reporting fake news in the run-up to the US elections by downplaying Trump's likelihood of winning. Anne Applebaum, you have experience and evidence of Russians creating articles to denigrate what you do.
Yes, I mean, I had a very small and not very important experience, which is that there was a series of articles written about me that sort of combined real facts and fake facts, and they were designed to imply that I was taking money from somebody to write anti-Russian articles. What was interesting about this wasn't the original articles, it was that then I became aware that there was a whole ecosystem of websites that had been set up in order to spread it. And you could follow the information from site to site until eventually the original stories were retweeted by Julian Assange, by WikiLeaks. And this is a year and a half ago. So I understood that it was a part of it was a carefully constructed system, and that they used it to spread other pieces of fake information too. The information about me is not very important, but it was my understanding of how it works that led me to get interested in the whole subject.
Jarek Kobek, you wrote a novel, indeed a satirical one, in which you said, "I hate the internet," but I think you don't. But on the other hand, you aren't too friendly with the conventional media.
Yeah, well, I think the idea of fake news is predicated on the idea that there is real news. And I think I can only speak to a US context, but in the run-up to the election, you could look at websites like the Huffington Post or the website of the New York Times, and there was a completely distorted view of reality. And I think the question then becomes, why have we landed on fake news as an explanation for Trump's victory?
Sorry, this distorted view of reality, fill it out a bit.
Sure. I mean, just the idea of reporting on the election as if it was one election, one nationwide election, when it was 50 independent elections happening in all of the different states. The Huffington Post, I think, gave Trump a 2% chance of victory the night before he won. Every time some egregious detail about Trump became apparent, the New York Times would run how many think pieces, how much reporting about this idea that this was the thing that was finally going to disqualify him.
Okay, pause there for a moment. Let me just ask for your reaction, Anne Applebaum.
Well, there's a difference between media making a mistake and, for example, assuming that the popular result, which was, of course, for Hillary Clinton, was the same thing as the state-by-state result. And, of course, he's absolutely right that that was the wrong way to cover the election. But there's a difference between that and systematic spreading of untrue stories, which are demonstrably fake, through not only fake websites, but through using bots, using Twitter trolls and sort of huge trolling operations, which we know, for example, the Kremlin does. Of course, they're not the only ones who do it, in an attempt to give people a deliberately false picture of reality. So no, I don't think those are quite the same thing.
I mean, for example, Mr. Kobek, we have this extraordinary moment when 1 million people picked up information that Pope Francis had endorsed Mr. Trump. It was simply untrue. It was fake.
I agree completely. I mean, there obviously is a difference between news that is, or quote unquote news that's broadly unfactual, and news that spins towards, news that has a certain spin on it for a certain audience.
Well, hang on a minute. You started this conversation by saying you didn't really believe fake news existed.
Well, I don't. I mean, the news all seems fake.
That was fake. The Pope Francis hadn't even opened his mouth and certainly mentioned Trump by name. He hadn't done either.
How is that different than giving Trump a 2% chance of winning? Or I'm sorry, 2%. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, well, the point surely here is that actually, in any case, Trump did indeed not win the popular vote, as Anne Applebaum has already said, by 2.7 million votes. That's a pretty big margin.
It's a big margin, but it's irrelevant. He's in the office.
So what is your real point? The point is that it's not fake news, it's lying?
No, I think the point is that post-Trump's victory, and, I'm not a Trump supporter, but post-Trump's victory, there has been a continual cycling through of ideas to explain why this victory happened. And I think, fake news is the one that we've landed on. But there certainly were others.
So at the end of the day, you're convinced fake news exists. It has to be tackled. You're obviously setting up an institution to do it.
Yes. I mean, I think the phenomenon of 20th century disinformation propaganda, and I'm talking about deliberate campaigns designed to mislead people, do exist. They are real, and there are ways in which we can fight them, both actively and passively, both by teaching people how to recognize them and also beginning to understand better how fact-checking works and can be used. And I think that's a valuable thing to do.
Anne Applebaum, thank you very much. And Jarek Kobek in Los Angeles, thank you very much.
And this being Fake News Week, in the interest of clarification, the petition that's up and running at the moment is Stop Donald Trump from coming on a state visit. There was a petition last year to stop him coming at all. John.
And that's Channel 4 News. Have a great evening.